So welcome. This is a Saturday morning session with Robert McDermott and Debashish Banerji. It was my great privilege to be part of an experiment in 1972 of living in the country in upstate New York with Robert McDermott and Robert and Deborah Lawler, Professor Jagannir Chubb, who taught philosophy at Bombay University, and I found out later was actually responsible for someone like Manoj Das to come to the yoga. So he played an important part in many people's lives as a professor of philosophy. And we also had Eugene Mickey Finn from the Boston Center, who's very dear to many of you here gathered this morning, and also to Admiral Rutledge Tompkins. I don't know of any circumstance where you would have a Navy Admiral and Marjorie Spalding, who was a singer of classical songs, and Eugene Mickey Finn, who was a second story man, a thief, turned to integral yoga. So that summer, 1972, was Sri Aurobindo's birth centenary year. And Robert McDermott had already published, many of you know, the last essays that Sri Aurobindo wrote on the supramental manifestation. Robert published under the title Mind of Light, which is the last of those essays through Dutton. And to have a national publisher bring Sri Aurobindo's essays to the public, there was, thanks to George Harlan Pudis and the India Library Society, an earlier edition of Adventure of Consciousness, and also Sri Aurobindo's major works. But there was always this difficulty of them reaching a wider audience. And Robert McDermott followed Mind of Light with the Essential Aurobindo, and Shokin, another commercial publisher, with a beautiful cover, also to bring something artistic into the presentation of the books. And it was very important, and as we learned from our friend David Wickenden, who also saw the Catholic Quarterly Cross Currents, that dedicated an issue and gathered these extraordinary scholars, Father Thomas Berry, up at Fordham, there was a book on Sri Aurobindo and Teilhard, and there was a whole interest, I think, and Robert will speak to this better than I can, in the Catholic community, I think largely due to the influence of Teilhard de Chardin. So Robert's contribution, both as a professor at Baruch and later as president of the California Institute for Integral Studies, inheriting this extraordinary institution that Haridas and Bina Chaudhuri set up, and brings us to Debashish Banerji, who is a professor there. And some of you knew the institute originally as the California Institute for Asian Studies. And it was really the first opportunity for people who were interested in yoga and yoga practice to get a master's and then doctoral degrees. And they, by creating the California Institute for Integral Studies, gave a path for people to practice as therapists and to have a track for professional income possibilities. And I think Esalen and CIIS were really instrumental, as California has been generally, to let the West know about the significance of Aurobindo's vision and philosophy. So I'm so grateful that Debashish, who has so many fields of expertise in art history and has mastered philosophy and really can give a kind of comprehensive vision that holds the big picture from both an Eastern and Western point of view. And now we have Debashish and Robert as this wonderful presence at the California Institute for Integral Studies and doing excellent work together and bringing together Steiner and Gandhi and Aurobindo and allowing people to cross-pollinate. So I thank you both very much for joining us and for all of our friends, and would ask Robert to give a few words of introduction. You need to unmute, and generally, if there are any questions, please put them in the chat box, and I'll try to help. And go ahead, Robert.
Okay, thank you, Julian, for the introduction. It's really wonderfully karmic and a great privilege that we have this long lineage from 1972 when I visited your class at Colgate University at the invitation of Warren Ramshaw. In fact, yeah. And then we continued, and you continued with Marjorie Spalding and your friend Brian, and it's really been. You didn't mention that when I was trying to publish something on writing of Sri Aurobindo, I then found out about Eric Hughes, who was an editor at E.P. Dutton. So there are karmic connections at every turn. It was really a great privilege to sometimes to just see how something would come into view that neither of us had consciously solicited, but nevertheless, sort of, if not to the rescue, certainly came in as an aid and to facilitate the process. So the California Institute of Integral Studies was the successor to an earlier institution back to 1951, which was organized by an American businessman named Louis Gainsborough. And it was he who then invited Frederick Spiegelberg, who then wrote to Sri Aurobindo. Probably it came to K.T. Setna to send Haridas Chaudhuri to America to join that group. And as so often is the case, timing was crucial. In this case, the timing was a negative factor. It was simply too early to create a doctoral institution based primarily on Indian yoga, and the institution failed after about 5 or 6 years. But Haridas continued to teach in San Francisco at the Cultural Integration Fellowship on Fulton Street and 4th, and he had quite remarkable students, including Michael Murphy and Dick Price, the co-founders of Esalen Institute, but others as well. And at that time, there was this fabulous and also complicated and dangerous time of the sort of the psychedelic revolution in San Francisco. And so Haridas was on the spiritual track, and others were on a psychedelic track, and some were on both. And so that was 1968 in April. And then it was a tiny institution of 50 students and 22 different programs, and not ready for accreditation. But the accreditation did come in 1981. And since that time, it has continued to grow and expand. some of it quite independent of the initial vision, which is, of course, a continuing challenge where Debashish and I are aligned in working hard to keep the mission, the Sri Aurobindo Mother Integral Yoga mission alive. And it's very important to some students that we do that, and others not so much. So it's quite a complex situation. Debashish just sent me an email yesterday about the new chair of the, no, not so new, but a chair of the board saying that he did a doctorate at CIIS and left not knowing as much as he wished he had about Sri Aurobindo. So why don't I turn now to Debashish to take up the thread.
Thank you, Robert, for that beautiful vista perspective into the past and founding of CIIS and where it stands right now. My connection with this entire work goes back to about 1978, I'd say, when I turned to Sri Aurobindo and the Mother shortly before that, and then I was in the Sri Aurobindo Society Center at Churchgate in Bombay, and they had a library, and two books stood out to me over there. One was called The Prophet of the Life Divine by Haridas Chaudhuri, and the other one was called The Language of the Gods by Judith Steinberg. I still remember that my very first day, I took note of those names, and I didn't know who they were. And I found myself intimately connected with the work of both these people after I came to America. Julian spoke about, and you two spoke about the first incarnation of CIIS, which was the American Academy of Asian Studies that was founded, as you said, in, I think, 1951. And both these figures were founding members of that particular institution. Judith Steinberg later left to go to Los Angeles and started the East-West Cultural Center. And my work in America really began at that center, in 1991. And I was there till 2006. I was president of the East-West Cultural Center. And then just not that long back in 2016, I was also connected with another interesting character who was a student of Haridas Chaudhuri, since you mentioned it, Robert, and that was Obadiah Harris, president of the University of Philosophical Research in Los Angeles, where I worked after the East-West Cultural Center as the academic dean for several years. And then after that work got over, you and I talked, Robert, and a certain set of circumstances was set into motion somewhat mysteriously by powers beyond our control. And in 2016, I found myself as the chair holder for Indian Philosophies and Cultures in the name of Haridas Chaudhuri at CIIS. So that's the long and short of my involvement at CIIS. The next year, I think 2017, I became the chair of the East-West Psychology Department. So those are my responsibilities at CIIS. And as Robert said, I think the two of us are right now. I know Barman was there earlier. Barman left. Barman and I went together to Auroville. We took a group to Auroville about 4 or 5 years back. And then a couple of years back, I took a group to Auroville. And then Robert and I traveled to Pondicherry and Auroville about a couple of years back. We've tried to keep that bridge alive. And that's our work so far at CIIS. As Robert said, not there's a small number of people that are really supporting that work right now. This was the heart of CIIS, but today it's a work that's still significant, but I think a very small part of what CIIS is today. By the way, there's a lot of noise coming. Somebody probably has their mic open.
I'm not hearing it.
Yeah, we had a little static. I think it's okay right now. Thank you, Debashish.
Yeah.
Continue.
I think I'll stop there and wait for you, Julian, or or Robert to take the story forward.
But let me just add very briefly. There's no way for other people to know this, but we have, thanks to Debashish, we have a new board member, Vaishali Chandra. You could maybe say a word about her, because she is very devoted to Sri Aurobindo and to the integral yoga, and is a new board member. And she joins another board member who is a funder. They're both funders, who heard. This is Mike Hebel, who heard Haridas Chaudhuri's lectures through the early 70s. He was a policeman in Golden Gate Park in 1967 and 1968, and all these years devoted to Sri Aurobindo, but also, I would say, primarily to Haridas and Bina, who's elected. And his work at the Institute is for that purpose, and is a supporter of the various initiatives that Debashish and I are trying to realize. So it's the number is small, but they're very devoted, and a small number of devoted people are more powerful than a large number of people who are not particularly devoted to anything. So I think it's a fair contest.
One of the reasons why I wanted to especially invite people who have institutional connections is to know the health of these institutions that are so important. And I know, Robert, you have been instrumental in bringing the California Institute for Integral Studies into the next century, into this century, and really was the right person at the right time to do the fundraising necessary to honor and save this legacy. And I'm interested in how you see it going forward, and where you and Debashish are collaborating, both intellectually and in publishing.
Yeah, and I would say our collaboration is primarily spiritual. I mean, it has an intellectual component, of course, and personal. We're good friends. We're very dear, devoted friends. But I think I know we both feel that we are instruments of spiritual karmic, like a kind of grace that we are conscious of. And so it gives me a chance to answer your question about funding and keeping the institution alive. So you referred to me as a fundraiser, but I wasn't. For better or worse, I was a fund recipient. That is to say, I knew somebody I was a friend of someone who worked with Lawrence Rockefeller. And she introduced me to Lawrence Rockefeller, who gave me $5 million. But I didn't do that. I sat in that room with him saying to myself, I wonder who's doing this. Because it was so clear that I was an instrument of something much larger. Now, here we are at a very remarkable moment that Debashish and I have discussed many times, and we will continue to discuss. Namely, we have a new president as of September 1st, entirely new to the institution and not connected to Sri Aurobindo or Indian or even spirituality in any conscious or a systematic way. So that's a big risk, because it's in response to another risk, namely the financial health of the institution. So some people say you can keep your mission and go out of business. And other people say, yes, but what good is it to be in business if we lose our mission? So that is a very alive topic. The good news is this person, this man, Mike Hebel, whom I mentioned, has had more than one conversation with the new man, Brock Bloomberg, who's been a very successful president of 2 institutions, who really knows how to be president. He knows how to raise money. Then the question is, will he raise money with a conscious commitment to what Debashish and I consider the mission? Well, it's a risk, and we don't know the answer to that question, but we will be alive and alert. And he says, yes, of course. What Debashish and Mike Hebel and I are trying to do should happen. He has said that it should happen. This is important. So we'll see. He doesn't come until September, but from day one, Debashish and I will be alert, and I hope he will engage us. But no one knows. What we know is that he's a very accomplished person and knows how to raise money.
So, as Robert was saying, Robert opened the door on some of the history of CIIS. CIIS is standing today thanks to a real act of grace that can be called nothing else. There's no other word to use it. It's standing today because Robert, as he said, was the recipient of actually over $9 million from Lawrence Rockefeller. Those are the feet of CIIS today. Lots of institutions with a kind of mission, not even directly connected with Sri Aurobindo, but with a spiritual mission, have closed. Most of them are closed. They're turning into business schools, engineering schools, professional schools of various kinds. And Julian, you mentioned clinical practice. CIIS is not a school of clinical practice. That's only one school within CIIS. If it was a school of clinical practice, that would have completely defeated the larger possibilities of Sri Aurobindo's work. The fact is that it's still largely a school of consciousness and transformation. That's what Robert does. He's right now, even after he left as chair, as president, he's emeritus president, but he's acting chair of philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. I'm chair of East-West psychology. These disciplines are really disciplines that are actually created to change our vision of things. What does it mean to be human and to be in the world today? So I think those are really important areas that otherwise would never be addressed were it not for this act of grace. But I think today what's really important is going forward that we increase the interest in Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. And for that to happen, it's a really important moment in time, because I think Sri Aurobindo has so much to give now when we are going through a real crisis, a crisis of our times. And there's so few people who can actually give what Sri Aurobindo has to give to the larger world. The community of Sri Aurobindo has increasingly closed in on itself. They can only talk Sri Aurobindo talk. They can't talk to anybody outside. It's not a porous community. And that's exactly where we need academic training. We need to learn how we can dialogue with others who don't see what we see. See, that's where the importance of something like CIIS comes in. And I think it's really important today for people in the Sri Aurobindo community to realize the importance of getting academic training and being able to communicate with others. We're not here merely to communicate among ourselves and have a good feeling about it. We're not here to communicate with others about mundane things that mean nothing to our deepest interests, we are here to be able to actually enlarge what it is that means, but that it means to bring Sri Aurobindo into our present problems.
Debashish, let me follow by a specific deed that Debashish and I are devoted to and almost completed, is a book of essays called Sri Aurobindo and Modern Thought. So I have written 3 essays: Sri Aurobindo and Gandhi, Sri Aurobindo and Teilhard de Chardin, and Sri Aurobindo and Rudolf Steiner. And so, Debashish, why don't you say something about your 3 chapters?
Yeah, so Robert has gone ahead of me, but what I'm supposed to write, I still haven't finished. But one of them is a chapter on Sri Aurobindo and the philosophy of becoming, which includes people like Nietzsche, Bergson, and Deleuze, and Gilles Deleuze. It's a lineage of the philosophy of becoming. And then I'm going to write on Sri Aurobindo and the poetics of Rabindranath Tagore and others who've tried spiritual poetics. And the other chapter is about Sri Aurobindo and universal spirituality, with Ramakrishna, Vivekananda as the main other figures. So this actually opens up topics which are really germane to our times, that are extremely debated, that have lots of issues within them, that people need to really grapple with and see where Sri Aurobindo stands in offering solutions to our times.
We had a wonderful session speaking with Oroville, talking about their Swadharma program and the number of young Indian professionals who are so accomplished academically and have risen through the ranks professionally, but have not found meaning. And that kind of alignment between their work and ideals. And I'm wondering if this COVID time has reflected that in the students that you have been in touch with.
What to say? Debashish and I both have students who are studying Sri Aurobindo, and some of them writing on Sri Aurobindo. So in a certain sense, that's the easy part, that for students to find us and to study with us is very it's uncomplicated. The difficulty is for such students, but probably for all students with a spiritual orientation, to find meaningful employment. The academic world is tight and closed to some extent, and it's very difficult for a person with a spiritual orientation to secure an academic position. But actually any young person with a spiritual orientation finds it hard to find meaningful employment. It's a tremendous challenge. Some of our students graduate with enormous debt and lots of knowledge, and it's difficult in a secular culture.
Yeah, but if I may follow up with what Robert is saying, both Robert's department, Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness, and my department, East-West Psychology, have recently opened online tracks. PCC opened it first, I think 2 years back, and we are about to open it in fall. It's going to be our first semester fully online, along with, of course, the residential track. And the response has been tremendous. I mean, it's amazing how quickly it has grown. In Robert's department has grown so quickly, it's unimaginable. And we are having people just knocking on the door, even before we've started. And you mentioned about the COVID, about our times, COVID times, and the question of whether that has had any impact. That has had an impact, I think. That is part of the reason. A lot of the people who are coming to us are feeling disillusioned with the way things have turned out in our times. And they're looking for new solutions. They don't know what they're going to do with these new solutions or what they are, but it's bringing them to school again. And I think, Robert will agree with me. This is the place of philosophy, really. We wonder what's the importance of something like philosophy or East-West psychology, etc. But if we stop for a moment to think about it, thought leaders really create an age. We are in the modern age because some people during what is called the European Enlightenment thought of the ideas that make up our world. And if our world is to change, new thought leaders must arise. And that's where these people, it doesn't matter what profession they're into. It's really a question of how they understand themselves and their place in the world and whether they can communicate it. They can communicate it while working as whatever, peons, but they can write, and also they can bring it into their lives. And it's really, what we hold out is change from within. You can't change things by holding them as objects with which you deal. That's technology. You change things by being who you want the world to be. So I think people are seeing that, and I think there is an interest. Robert was talking about the scarcity of students at one time. I think over the last 2 years, we are beginning to see that is changing. We are getting a lot more students. I'd like to see a lot more people interested in Sri Aurobindo as part of that student body.
Right. The department that I teach and sometimes chair that Debashish referred to, when one of our faculty members created the master's program, it dramatically increased enrollment. Then we created the doctoral program, and the same thing happened. So the first year, every year we had an increase of 15 students. But once we went online, it jumped to 30, and the next year it jumped to 55. So, and I'm now, when I see my list of students, they're in Norway, they're in Australia, they're in Tierra del Fuego. It's astonishing. And they are academically very strong and very devoted. So that's really quite a good development. And Debashish is involved with Vaishali, the board member I mentioned, in trying to figure out how to do more online with students in India, in Pondicherry, in the ashram, and etc. So many developments are sort of gaining strength, I think, supported by the others.
I also wanted to say, talking about developments that are supported by others in the community, that I know, Julian, that you've invited for this AUM, Santosh Krinsky, and that's wonderful. That because he's been doing quiet work, very significant work for a long time. I've known him for many years. And, I connected with him after getting to CIIS, and he immediately came forward and said, if you'd like to publish, I'll help you. We'll publish your works through Lotus Light. And so we've been, my first edited volume, Integral Yoga Psychology, was done by them. I think a very handsome work. It's making a very strong impact. It's going, its circulations are good. And right now, we are absolutely in the finishing stages of going into production. Robert and I are co-editing a book called Philosophia, Wisdom, Goddess, Traditions. The whole idea behind the book is to revise the understanding of philosophy, because the word philosophy really means love of Sophia. And so who is Sophia? And what does love of Sophia mean? What does it mean to think spiritually in this time, in our world? That's what the book is about, and you'll see it very soon, because just yesterday I received the final proofs, the cover. Even Robert does not know this, but he'll get to see it next week.
I'm very excited. This is everyone who hears about this book says, "Oh, such a book is needed. Such a book is needed." To which I say, "Yeah, well, that's why we felt invited to do it." They're very good essays, really strong by scholars around the world, in Indian, Buddhist,
Christian,
several Christian. Go ahead, Debashish. Yeah, I did one on Steiner. Debashish did the one on Sri Aurobindo and the mother. So it's sometimes we can do something directly on Sri Aurobindo and the mother, but other times it might be more effective to have them among others, so that they are not alone.
Absolutely. I mean, that's really the point, what Robert just said, because I think we really need to bring them into conversation. It's really time to open up the ideas of Sri Aurobindo and the mother, bring them into conversation, show the larger constellation of thoughts that are leading towards something that is hopeful and something that is really transformative for humankind.
Well, your use of the word hopeful is so key right now, because I know those of us who have spent the last months in isolation see on Amazon or Netflix one dystopian future after another. And it has always been my great gratitude and inspiration from when I first heard about Oroville was to see people who were putting their ideals into practice, and that they were doing it under really difficult circumstances. We had a gathering the other day to talk about these women who were pioneers, and they really brought home the fact that the local people had the distended bellies, that if it didn't rain, they didn't eat, that it was very much a subsistence agriculture. And I think, Kathy could speak to this as well, to know that the ground reality of these basics of water conservation, of planting trees, of attuning with nature, and then seeing nature recover. What a great privilege for me as a young person to have gone to Oroville in 74, 75, and come back and be lost in a forest, and to have that sense of regeneration and complexity happen in my lifetime. And so it's a great tribute to those pioneers and this vision of Sri Aurobindo and Mother to put their ideals. Udar used to use the metaphor that the ashram was the laboratory and Oroville was the field experiment, but that people would come together and then under very adverse situations be able to get things to grow. And then I think back also to the tsunami, where we saw the whole community faced with a terrific tragedy come forward with generosity and competence and action that was relevant to the needs and could channel funds to the women. I'm wondering if you're seeing women as they were in the Swadharma program, also enrolling and becoming involved with CIIS, because I see women's studies in the emergent empowerment of the feminine, and even Matrimandir as a feminine temple, leading an intuitive new paradigm.
Just this morning, actually starting last night, but again this morning, I'm involved in a conversation with my good friend Sean Kelly, who's very much focused on what he calls they call the end times and whether it's even possible to have a hope for the future. So he brought to my attention a book which another colleague, Alfonso Montori, is editing on creative futures. And I suggested to Sean that Debashish should write an essay on a creative future. And Sean and I are talking about doing a kind of a collaborative or dialogue of an essay, which would include to my mind, the three great visionary thinkers of the 20th century, Teilhard de Chardin and Sri Aurobindo and Rudolf Steiner. So it's an interesting question. Every time I'm in this talk about what does the future hold, is whether these great spiritual beings in alignment with even greater spiritual beings, Krishna or Buddha or Christ, are saving the earth against us. I mean, they need people to work with. As Sri Aurobindo says, every great initiate and avatar needs a community, and without which the teachings just lie fallow. So Debashish and I are often talking about our colleagues who really are dealing with whether there's any hope at all. And we're saying, well, if you look at the same level where the problem is caused, then perhaps not. But if you look at another level, then there can be and should be, has to be a commitment to a creative future. So I don't know, Debashish, you don't know that I've used your name in that way, but I expect that you will in the next few days. I think it's important to be in that book.
Oh, thank you. Yes, Robert, I agree. Also, I really, resonate with what you said, Julian, about Auroville's work. And, what you said about Udar, talking about the ashram as the laboratory, and, Auroville as the field work, that has even deeper and a really significant sort of meaning, significances, and that has to do with the fact that Sri Aurobindo, who did his own, sort of absolutely groundbreaking sadhana in Pondicherry, worked to create something individually, but what has happened is that particular work has tended to become more and more individualistic. In a sense, it has to start with the individual. It's not really a work that can actually be done communally without the individual taking responsibility for their sadhana. But it has to engage with the world. And today, more than ever before, it cannot be a laboratory that is closed within four walls anymore. And the danger of that is all around us. The danger of that is that our entire understanding of the world, of pluralism, of ethics, is completely something that we throw out the door when we close our eyes to the world and make it into just an individual practice. People look at it as a devotional practice or some kind of interior psychology or transformative process, but they forget the fact that unless we treat it, this is the hope aspect that Robert was talking about, our immediate problems with the world, our climate crisis, our ecological responsibility, our responsibility to others of this world, other beings, other creatures, other cultures. What are we doing about it? Are we engaging? Are we enlarging our consciousness to include that as part of our sadhana? If we are not, then there's something missing in our time. And that's how we have to understand integral yoga today. That's the way in which we look at integral yoga as an academic pursuit at CIIS.
Julian, do you have questions that you especially want Debashish and I to speak about?
Yes, I put in the chat, there is in the lower right-hand corner a little box where you can type in a question, or if someone who's with us can see at the bottom of the screen, there's a hand like this. If you click on that, you're raising your hand and we'll recognize you and ask you to unmute to ask your question. Or if you just want to type the question, we can see that. So please, I see Tong with her hand raised. So Tong, you want to go first?
Yes. Thank you, Julian, for organizing this, and thank you, Debashish and Robert, for being with us. Debashish, you and I, we have had a few conversations on my possible PhD, doing PhD on Aurobindo, you remember? Yeah. So hi, friends. Maybe I'm the only one from Europe here. It's all US meeting, but I'm from Amsterdam. And I lived here since last 30 years, but I'm originally Chinese. I'm made in China and came here 25 years, when I was 25 years old, and have been on the sadhana of Aurobindo since last 18 years. So several things I want to say. I first really resonate the gratitude that Julian expressed with Robert and Debashish and your work in preserve the core of the work of Aurobindo in CIIS. And I have been studying that. I was really emotionally attached to that institute, although without never being there, because I feel like that is a kind of beacon of Aurobindo's work in the world outside of ashram, Auroville, can do some work for the world, and from there to manifest more. So that's why I've been following you guys, and especially when Robert, you were the chairman of the thing. Anyhow, when my PhD study was later drifted to somewhere else, maybe I will still do it one day. So first, that's resonating. The second is around how important that Debashish, you brought this in conversation, in dialogue, in not as devotees of Aurobindo, with attached to it, somebody has to follow Aurobindo's integral yoga, but really as a fast of wisdom and practice one perspective that is introduced to the world. I noticed how important is that if we are personally so attached to the yoga itself and then try to convince other people, then we'll get this type of thing. People will not open up. And so that was, and I have example of that. I was in China, and especially last 3 years, and also last 2 years since COVID, I had online a lot of meetings with very advanced Taoist practitioners, Buddhist practitioners. At the same time, both has Western education. They came back to China, Chinese, and they started to study their original heritage. One sharing Aurobindo symbols purely from way of being, and purely from openness to very objective conversation. And people were so open up. They were writing, oh, I need to write Aurobindo. I really want to know more, because they saw in their own work something is missing in their own path. So I think this type of conversation will really open up. I learned being a Chinese. I started last 3 years to start to deepen my Taoistic heritage. And I noticed, gosh, there's in Taoistic heritage, there's also one line more tantric practice for I Ching. One I met, a Taoist practitioner who is also studied in the West, and Chinese lady studied in the West as a biologist. And when I noticed her work, I did work with her, collaborated with her, I saw, wow, Aurobindo's teaching integral yoga was there too. And so many different traditions were working on this evolutionary movement, the force. And that's why collaboration and Taoistic practice has so much detailed so many thousand years of practices on sadhana on the body, which she showed me. And she showed me also how the ascent and descent work in Taoist traditions really enriched my understanding of my own sadhana with integral yoga. I mean, that is what you meant, this cross-pollination, that in conversation, open up, not in a closed experimenting things. I resonate that a lot.
Yeah.
And another point. Yeah. And the third thing I want to respond is is around when we introduce Aurobindo's teaching to the world, because his work has relevance really to many, many of the world's issues. I use his work I'm a consultant, I'm an entrepreneur, I have my own transformational consulting. All his work was guiding me, working with UN, using psychology, social development, ideal of human unity, and my work with European unions, with multinationals. Life Divine I use for my consulting work for multinationals, because how the divine created the world is how company can create their future. Co-creatively with society,
Schedule, we're going to have to move because other people have questions.
Yeah,
I was going to say
we have to keep it short. We have to let everybody.
Sorry. I just want to say that there are many ways of expanding, this perspective, not only through academic, but also through different paths of way. But my question is actually, here comes my question. My question is, like, you are in the philosophy, in the field of philosophy, Aurobindo's work, many is a high philosophy. Do you do collaboration with other philosophy department of other universities worldwide? Because that is a medium to really bring Aurobindo's philosophy to that platform for the mainstream philosophical thinkers.
Julian, I think I have to move questions.
Sorry, I just wanted to say, Tom, you can only collaborate with whoever wants to collaborate with you. You can't force yourself on anybody. And today, Sri Aurobindo is not a hot topic. There's very few people working academically on Sri Aurobindo today. I think what we are trying to do is to create forums of dialogue, and at the individual level, not so much, finding other departments. If they're open, fine, we'll work with them. But it's more at the individual level. We are bringing scholars together. We are talking to scholars. And, talking about wisdom and devotion. Let's not get it wrong. I am a devotee of Mother and Sri Aurobindo. There's no doubt about it. But I don't stick to a lexicon. I don't have a certain dictionary that I talk my talk with. I believe in experience and feelings as an individual that can use other languages to express myself. There is no limit to language. And that's how dialogue takes place. Dialogue takes place inside us.
I want to point out that Tom O'Brien had a question that fit right into Tong's, how she ended. So Tom, please go ahead.
So I'm concerned about global cooperation amongst multinational or international or spiritual or academic organizations, because I recognize we are living in a crucial time. And I'm looking for and hoping for more cooperation amongst peoples everywhere. I leave it to you to give some inspiration. Thank you.
I think one of the important institutions with respect to cooperation is the Parliament of World Religions, which meets every year and has website and really is a constant source of connection and inspiration throughout the world. There's also United Religions Initiative, which comes out of San Francisco. There are many endeavors, often with websites that are instructive and inspiring. And Sri Aurobindo devotees should try to be in on those conversations, if at all possible.
Yeah, I agree. As we just mentioned, there are other institutions, and we are really interested in actually, continuing our dialogue with Auroville, for example. We are taking students to Auroville every 2 years. How does just as Tong mentioned, the work is not only done academically, it's done in life. I think, as Julian also said, Auroville is a kind of a space where the work is being manifest in life. But what's the crossover between academics and that? What is the intersection? How do we get the immanent ideas of that work into language? That is where we're interested in. We also are collaborating with other fields. Right now I'm talking to you from India, and I've collaborated with top academics over here to start a new organization, which is called the Indian Post-Humanism Network. And it's part of a global post-humanism network. So post-humanism is a contemporary philosophical discourse, which is not, it's not just, you know, I mean, how do we think about becoming the Superman? It's a really sophisticated contemporary philosophical discourse. And how do we open up that particular discourse to include some of the ideas of Sri Aurobindo? That's what's going on. We just held our first inaugural symposium, which was really significant. You know, lots of very important papers were produced. So those are the areas in which we are trying to create a new opening for Sri Aurobindo and the Mother.
I'd like to remind you that we're just on the cusp of Sri Aurobindo's 150th. And it happens that the Prime Minister is particularly interested in the legacy of Swami Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo. So I expect that there will be, and I might ask Richard to say something about what he sees, and also just to give a little headline about his talk about the relationship between India and China that he will be presenting tomorrow at this time with Devdeep Ganguly from the ashram. Richard, would you just like to say a couple of words?
Since I'm going to have a whole session tomorrow night with Devdeep, with whom I went to China in 2019, I won't say too much about that. I'm focusing particularly on what's happening in China now, which I'll talk about then, tomorrow morning, I guess, for most of you. In India, one thing that's being done specially for the 150th anniversary is a book is coming out. Some of you may have contributed to it, in fact, called Reading Sri Aurobindo, published by Penguin, which is an introduction to Sri Aurobindo's works, his complete works, with one article on each of his major works. Practically every volume of the Sri Aurobindo, of course, some works are 2 volumes, and some volumes contain more than one work, like the Human Cycle and the Ideal of Human Unity. I happen to have written 3 of those. Debashish has written, I think, 1 or 2, and in any case, this is one thing. It's published by Penguin. It's intended to be a book that people will find in, you know, airport bookstores and that sort of thing. So that's, otherwise, I've heard about various things, but I haven't, there is quite a bit of interest in celebrating in some way the 150th anniversary in India. I don't know whether the government has anything in mind in particular.
There is this interesting history that you can Google, the number of searches on Sri Aurobindo over time. And I'm going to be very interested to see whether there is some kind of correspondence. These things sometimes are going to a higher law and not our expectations. But I think, you know, what you've just described is echoing Robert McDermott's work in publishing 6 Pillars. Because he invited scholars in America to write on Sri Aurobindo's major works, and so hopefully that will have an echo effect here in America to re-look at Sri Aurobindo's major works and commentary from that book. Any other questions?
I just wanted to, I'm not sure if I have a question, but just wanted to thank Robert and Debashish for kind of
connecting me on the surface of my consciousness with the Institute affairs, which I'm not directly connected with right now, but just about every night I have Institute dreams. So it's kind of more organized version of it to hear from you. But one thing I do want to say is that when I was working with the Haridas Chaudhuri archives, I found something he'd written somewhere, maybe a small note or something, that the Institute, the CIIS, is really not an academic institution in the ordinary sense of it, that it is a hybrid or an integration of spiritual discipline and academic discipline. And sometimes I hear people talking about what's at CIIS in a way that's a little dismissive, as if to say, oh, it's just academic, you know, but that's really not the ideal of it. And I think that there are many programs and many institutions, many students at the Institute who use different methodologies, have a lot of experiential and intuitive work connected with their academic writing. So the academic writing is more of how they share it with the world and not necessarily the level of experience. So I just wanted to remind us of the potential that CIIS has for really exporting that kind of academic, this new way of integrating academic and spirituality. If Robert or Debashish have anything to add to that, I'd be happy to hear.
Yeah, Bhavan, I'm sure Robert has important things to say about it. I'd also like to say, I think there's one particular person who's making a lot of noise. Can we shut that off? The name is Vasisht Sharma. Okay, thank you. The early beginnings of universities have always been what you just mentioned, Bhavan. In the West, higher education begins in churches, in monasteries. And in Asia, it also begins in institutions like Takshashila and Nalanda, which were really places of spiritual practice and of thought, of sustained distinctions in ideas. So I think in a way, you're absolutely right. That was the aim of Haridas Chaudhuri, and that was the aim of Judith Steinberg as well. That's exactly where they were coming from. So today we have a new category called the Scholar Practitioner. I think that's a return of this kind of scholarship. And, I think a very large number of students at CIIS, perhaps all of them, are scholar practitioners. That's what attracts them to a place like CIIS, that they are spiritual practitioners of some discipline, and they're trying to engage these at the academic level. Robert, would you care to say something about
yes,
this?
Only to repeat what we've said. CIIS is trying to hold two sets of disciplines or worldviews which are kept apart in our culture. And so spiritual practitioners and people committed to a particular spiritual worldview can easily look on CIIS as a mere academic institution. But people then in the academy can look on CIIS and saying, oh, it's all involved with spiritual. That's not academic. And so we are both we're in dialogue with both groups that are not sufficiently in dialogue with each other. And we're trying to say to the academy, the intellect is actually limited, and it needs heart and spirit forces to deepen it. And then we say to the spiritual practitioners, you're doing great work, thank you very much, but you really need also to engage the intellectual world and the professional world and come and help us. So it's that's, but that's what Debashish was saying before. We have to engage the world, and with Debashish and I and other people at CIIS are doing that in academic pursuits and academic requirements. We want to be an accredited institution, so we have to have evidence of our scholarship. It's an ongoing process, and it's most fortunate that the school has survived as long as it has, and with people who keep coming and energizing and strengthen it can go on for a very long time. In the world, it's needed. It's an important institution in the world.
In the commentary, Karun Das mentions about the presentations at the Parliament of World Religions on the 100th anniversary, including Luc Binet, who is very involved with Satprem and the agenda, and that Savitri was read for that 100th anniversary in Chicago. And then Andrea asks if you might be able to speak briefly about this connection between Steiner, Gandhi, and Sri Aurobindo.
Yes, well, in my book, Steiner and Kindred Spirits, I tried to do what we are talking about with respect to Sri Aurobindo, namely to put him in dialogue, not competition, but complementarity and mutuality with other great figures. Gandhi and Teilhard de Chardin, Rudolf Steiner, these are very great figures. And of course, the Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh, these are the best figures we have. And so we do not want them to be in isolation, and we don't want Sri Aurobindo and the mother to be in isolation. I mean, they each give credibility to the others. Instead of there being a secular world and one spiritual teacher, there's a secular world and many spiritual teachers who I call kindred spirits, and who are supporting each other indirectly. Though, if I may say, they didn't do as good a job supporting each other as we are trying to do on their behalf. To be honest, they did not. Sri Aurobindo was pretty good. Teilhard was pretty good for some of them. Were not so good. And really said, this is the way, this is the way. Well, actually, there are other ways. We're probably running out of time, Julian. I think.
Yes, I thank you both so much for our time together. Robert, I'm very much looking forward to welcoming you and Ellen to Madhugiri, and Debashish also. We so much would be grateful to have you come to Woodstock and greet people here in the Northeast. And I just am wondering if Kathy is still on the call, if she just might turn on her camera and just have a moment to share amongst ourselves informally and to say goodbye. And those of you who can, please join me at noon for a dialogue with Santosh Krinsky, whose work with Lotus Light and publishing and outreach has been so important. And then this evening, Lara Davis is going to talk about very practical things, the building with Earth and its environmental impact. And tonight at 9 o'clock East Coast, kind of a general hangout to be able to share amongst ourselves. But Kathy, it's nice to see you dialing in from Oroville. And you know Robert and I appreciate your work so very much. Have you unmuted? Somehow.
Yeah, sorry, I have. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's just been a total pleasure to listen in. And yeah, as you know, I feel also a lot of resonance and connection with CIIS, and of course I'm living in Oroville, and yeah, it's just really lovely to meet you all on this call, and feel particularly touched by the work that Debashish and Robert that you're doing to really keep the dialogue alive and contemporary and to really speak to the times that we're in and really recognize the importance of grounding the vision. So yeah, it was just beautiful to be here today with you all.
It's lovely to see you, Kathy. It's quite thank you.
Yeah, thank you too. I'm really happy to see you too, Robert. And you too, Debashish. And Julian as well, of course. Thanks for hosting it and putting this event together. Yes,
my great delight. And so Linda, Matteo, Tong, Seth, Andrew, Tomas, Jonathan, who is a student. You want to unmute and say hello? Hello, goodbye.
Hi, everybody.
Tell us about your collaboration with Debashish.
Yeah, I mean, I moved from India, living in Calcutta, to go to CIIS and be under Debashish's mentorship. Just finished my my PhD coursework, and I'm working on my dissertation now. And I had an absolutely unbelievable experience at CIIS. I lived in San Francisco, just down the street from the school for 3 years. Year and a half in COVID, but the first year and a half was full of amazing classes in person and trip to Aurobindo. But yeah, the one thing that was coming up that I feel important to add to the conversation is the role of, we're talking about the scholar practitioner, but also the scholar activist, the role of activism in this work. And that's something that I think it was a little unexpected for me, but as Debashish helped me understand some of the main questions in my life. Why did I move to India to learn Indian music? For instance, what was jazz doing in my life in terms of how I was building my identity and how I was put into relation with my cultural container and the kind of the greater society in general. But I think activism is a pretty important part of how I am looking at not only music now, but spirituality. And that goes right back to the roots of some of the questions of becoming that guided Sri Aurobindo in his yoga, right? So that's also a big part of my journey, but I think also it's built into the institution of CIIS.
Well, it's nice to have Canada represented, and that you came and had this great contact with Debashish and with Robert. And yes, long live CIIS, and we look forward, Debashish and Robert, to your book coming out, and we'll do our best to make it available and known and read. So any final unmutings and hello, goodbye?
Only to thank you, Julian. You're doing great work, and we're in your debt.
And I and yours. All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay, bye now.
We'll start in again at noon, those of you who care to join us. Goodbye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very good. Okay, Richard, see you tomorrow at 10, and look forward to that.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, how long should we plan on making our presentation? Because you had originally said 2 hours. This has been much less than that.
Yeah, I think the schedule allows for as much time as we want to take. Generally, after an hour and 15 minutes, people have been sitting long enough. But we have 2 hours available, and it just depends on the interest and dynamic. So I would say an hour and 20 anyway, and we'll see what the question and answer is.
Okay.
And you can present via, just one second.